My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. For most of my life, I believed the bruises on my arms were normal. I thought every child had to earn their dinner by sitting perfectly still for hours, hands folded, eyes down, waiting for permission to breathe. I thought love came with conditions, and those conditions were impossible to meet. The realization hit me 3 months ago, sitting in Dr. Reynolds' office when she asked me a simple question that shattered everything. I thought I knew about my childhood. Sarah, can you tell me about a time when your parents showed you unconditional love? The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was devastating. I sat there, 28 years old, successful in my career, independent, strong, and I couldn't answer. Not because I was being dramatic or seeking attention, but because there wasn't a single memory I could recall where love wasn't earned, where affection wasn't conditional, where their approval didn't come with a price stop. My parents, Margaret and Robert Mitchell, were pillars of our small Connecticut community. Dad was a respected banker, Mom a devoted church organist. They hosted dinner parties, attended every school board meeting, and never missed a Sunday service. To everyone else, they were the perfect family. The neighbors envied our well-maintained lawn, our matching Christmas sweaters, our post-family. Photos that line the hallway, but photos lie. They freeze moments, strip away context, hide the trembling hands just out of frame. I remember being 5, maybe 6, standing in our pristine kitchen while Mom explained the rules. Children should be seen and not heard, Sarah. Good girls don't make noise. Good girls don't ask for things. Good girls wait to be spoken to. Her voice was calm, measured, the same tone she used when discussing grocery lists or weather. There was no anger, no raised voice, just a quiet certainty that this was how the world worked. How I should work, the punishment for breaking these. Rules wasn't violent in the traditional sense. There were no black eyes or broken bones. Instead, there was isolation. Hours spent in my room with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of family life continuing without me downstairs. There was the silent treatment that could last for days, where I became invisible in my own home. There was the removal of meals, of comfort, of any sense of security. You need to learn self-control, Dad would say, his voice never rising above conversational level. The world doesn't revolve around you, Sarah. The sooner you understand that, the better prepared you'll be for real life. Real life, as if the life I was living wasn't real. As if the fear that lived in my chest like a permanent resident wasn't real. As if the way I learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less, wasn't preparing me for anything except a lifetime of believing I didn't deserve space in the world. They weren't monsters. That's what makes this so complicated, so difficult to explain to people who want clear villains and obvious victims. They never called me names. They never hit me in anger. They provided food, shelter, clothing, education. By every external measure, I was cared for. But care and love are different things, and I'm only now learning to tell them apart. The emotional distance in our house was so complete that it felt normal. We didn't hug. We didn't say I love you. Physical affection was reserved for company, performed for the neighbors who might be watching. Even then it felt choreographed, hollow. Mom's hand on my shoulder during photos was stiff, temporary. Dad's rare smiles were measured, appropriate to the audience. Asterisk, I learned to read their moods like weather patterns, scanning for signs of approaching storms. Dad's slight frown when he came home from work meant I should disappear until dinner. Mom's particular way of arranging flowers meant she needed absolute silence. The sound of their voices through my bedroom wall at night, never arguing, never passionate, just low, controlled discussions about my behavior, my failures. My need for more discipline. School became my refuge, though I didn't understand it. Then, Mrs. Patterson, my third grade teacher, was the first adult who smiled at me without expecting anything in return. She praised my artwork, encouraged my reading, let me help organize her classroom during recess when other children were playing. I lived for those moments of acknowledgement, hoarding them like precious stones. But even at school, I was different. Other children seemed to move through the world with a confidence I didn't understand. They raised their hands eagerly, spoke without being spoken to, laughed loudly during lunch. I watched them like an anthropologist studying an alien species, trying to decode what gave them this freedom I'd never known. When I was 8, something happened that I've never told anyone, not even Dr. Reynolds. It was a Tuesday, and I'd forgotten to put my math homework in my backpack. The realization hit me during morning announcements, and panic flooded my system. Not because of the teacher's reaction, Mrs. Patterson was kind, understanding. The panic was about going home, about explaining to my parents why I'd been irresponsible. Spent the entire day planning how to tell them, rehearsing words that might minimize their disappointment. I considered lying, saying I'd completed it, but left it at school. But lies were worse than mistakes in our house. They represented moral failing, character defects that required more serious correction. When I finally confessed at dinner, the response wasn't anger, it was worse. It was that particular form of disappointment my parents had perfected, the kind that made me feel like I'd fundamentally failed as a human being. "Sarah," Mom said, setting down her fork with deliberate care, "how can we trust you with bigger responsibilities if you can't handle something as simple as homework?" The consequence was 3 days without television, books, or any form of entertainment. 3 days of sitting in my room after school, staring at walls, thinking about my failure. But the real punishment was the way they looked at me, or rather, didn't look at me. I became a cautionary tale they discussed in my presence, as if I couldn't hear them. Some children need more structure, Dad would say to Mom during those endless dinners where I sat silent, chewing mechanically. Trying to become invisible dot by the time I was 10, I developed what I now recognize as hypervigilance. I could sense tension in a room before anyone spoke. I could predict my parents' moods based on the way they closed doors, the pace of their footsteps, the particular silence that preceded criticism. This skill served me well academically. I became an excellent student, anticipating what teachers wanted before they asked for it. But it was exhausting, living in a constant state of alert, always scanning for danger that might not come, but usually did. The worst part wasn't the punishments themselves, it was the gaslighting that followed. Not deliberate, perhaps, but devastating nonetheless. When I would cry, they'd explain that I was being dramatic. When I'd express frustration, they'd remind me that I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me discipline. When I'd beg for affection, for some sign that I mattered beyond my behavior, they'd lecture me about self-centeredness and the importance of earning love through good choices. Adolescence brought new challenges. My body was changing, my emotions becoming more complex, but the rules remained the same. Good girls didn't ask questions about their bodies. Good girls didn't express anger or frustration. Good girls certainly didn't challenge authority or voice opinions that differed from their parents. I remember the morning I woke up to find blood on my sheets for the first time. I was 12, terrified, and had only the vaguest understanding of what was happening. When I finally worked up the courage to tell Mom, her response was clinical, efficient. She handed me a box of pads, a pamphlet about menstruation, and told me this was now something I needed to manage quietly. There was no comfort, no reassurance that this was normal, no acknowledgement that this might be scary or confusing. Just another responsibility to handle without bothering anyone. High school intensified everything. Academic pressure became crushing, because failure wasn't just disappointing, it was evidence of fundamental character flaws. When I brought home a B plus in chemistry, the silence at dinner was deafening. Not anger, not shouting, just profound disappointment that hung in the air. Like smoke. "We know you're capable of better, Sarah," Dad said finally. "The question is whether you care enough to try." The implication was clear. My grades reflected my worth as a person, my love for my family, my commitment to the values they tried to instill. A B plus wasn't just a grade, it was proof that I was selfish, lazy, ungrateful for the opportunities they'd provided. The weight of that interpretation crushed something inside me that I'm still trying to repair. I threw myself into perfectionism. With religious fervor, every assignment became a chance to prove my worth. Every test was an opportunity to earn their approval. I studied until my eyes burned, sacrificed sleep, friendships, any semblance of normal teenage experience in pursuit of grades that might finally make them proud. And when I achieved those perfect scores, when I brought home report cards filled with A's, their response was always the same: a brief nod, a comment about maintaining standards, and the immediate shift to discussing what I needed to improve. There was never celebration, never acknowledgement that I'd exceeded expectations. Excellence was the baseline, not an achievement. Anything less was failure, and failure was a moral shortcoming that required correction. This created a devastating psychology where I learned to associate my value as a person with external achievements while simultaneously believing that no achievement was ever enough. The isolation during these years was profound. I had acquaintances at school, but no real friends. How could I? Friendship required vulnerability, sharing, allowing people to see who you really were. But I didn't know who I really was beneath the careful performance of being the perfect daughter. I'd been so focused on meeting their expectations that I'd never developed my own identity. My own wants, my own voice. Dating was forbidden. Not explicitly, but through a series of subtle messages about trust, reputation, and the kind of girls who got distracted by boys. When Tommy Chen asked me to junior prom, I was terrified to even mention it at home. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. "You're too young to date," Mom said without looking up from her magazine. "Besides, you have more important things to focus on." The dismissal was casual, final, allowing no room for discussion or appeal. I watched other teenagers navigate relationships, heartbreak, the messy complexity of growing up, while I remained suspended in a kind of emotional childhood, dependent on my parents' approval for everything. They made every decision for me: what classes to take, what activities to join, what colleges to consider. Choice was presented as a luxury I hadn't earned, a responsibility I wasn't ready for. Astra's senior year brought college applications and the first real glimpse of freedom on the horizon. But even this was tightly controlled. They'd already decided I would attend their alma mater, study business or accounting, something practical that would lead to stable employment. My secret dream of studying literature or psychology was never voiced, never even considered as a possibility. Dreams were selfish indulgences that distracted from responsible planning. The acceptance letter to Columbia arrived in March. I'd applied secretly, using fee waivers and borrowed recommendation letters, driven by a desperate need to prove I could succeed somewhere they hadn't chosen for me. When I showed them the letter, expecting perhaps surprise or even pride, their reaction was swift and devastating. "You applied behind our backs," Dad said, his voice carrying that familiar disappointment that cut deeper than any anger. "After everything we've done for you, you chose deception over communication." The conversation that followed wasn't about the opportunity, the achievement, or my future. It was about trust, respect, and my apparent inability to appreciate their guidance. They made it clear that attending Columbia would mean losing their financial support, their approval, and potentially their relationship entirely. The choice was presented as simple: follow their plan and maintain family harmony, or pursue my own path and accept the consequences of selfishness. At 17, financially dependent and emotionally unprepared for complete independence, I chose compliance. I chose them. The summer before college was suffocating. Every day reinforced the message that I'd learned to live by. My value was contingent on their approval, and their approval required complete submission to their vision of who I should be. I worked at Dad's bank, filing papers and answering phones, preparing for a future that felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. College at their chosen school was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who didn't know my family's expectations, who couldn't monitor my every choice. But freedom felt dangerous when you'd never learned to trust your own judgment. I spent my freshman year paralyzed by simple decisions, calling home constantly for guidance on everything from class schedules to meal choices. My roommate, Jennifer, was everything I'd never been allowed to be: spontaneous, emotional, unapologetically herself. She cried when she was sad, laughed loudly when something was funny, got angry when she felt mistreated. Watching her navigate emotions with such honesty was like seeing someone speak a foreign language I desperately wanted to learn. "You're so calm," she told me one night after a particularly stressful day. "I wish I could be more like you." She meant it as a compliment, but it felt like an indictment. Calm wasn't a personality trait, it was survival strategy. I wasn't serene, I was suppressed. The difference was crucial, though I wouldn't understand it for years. Academic success continued to be my primary identity. One maintained perfect grades, earned praise from professors, stayed on track for graduation with honors, but the cost was enormous. I had no close friendships, no romantic relationships, no real sense of who I was beyond my performance as a student. Social events felt like tests I didn't know how to study for, where the rules were unspoken and constantly changing. When other students complained about their families, shared stories of arguments or disagreements, I listened with fascination and envy. They spoke about their parents with such casual familiarity, mentioning fights that ended in reconciliation, moments of genuine connection despite conflict. Their relationships seemed to have room for growth, change, negotiation. Mine felt set in stone, unchangeable, defined by roles we'd never agreed to but couldn't escape. Junior year brought my first serious relationship, though I hid it from my parents for months. Michael was patient, kind, everything I'd been taught to be suspicious of in myself and others. He encouraged me to speak up in class, to share my opinions, to take up space in conversations. With him, I began to glimpse who I might be if I stopped performing perfection and started living authentically. But guilt poisoned everything. Every moment of happiness felt stolen. Every laugh seemed like betrayal of my family's values. I'd been so thoroughly trained to associate my needs with selfishness that loving someone, being loved in return, felt fundamentally wrong. When Michael told me he loved me, my first instinct wasn't joy, it was panic. I didn't know how to receive love that wasn't conditional, that didn't require constant earning and re-earning. The relationship lasted 8 months before my inability to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe I deserved affection, destroyed it. Michael tried to understand, but how could he? How could anyone who'd grown up with normal family dynamics comprehend the psychological cage I'd been raised in? When he finally ended things, his words haunted me. "It's like you're afraid to be happy, Sarah, like you think you don't deserve good things." He was right, of course. Happiness felt dangerous because it had always been temporary in my experience, always followed by punishment or withdrawal of affection. Joy was suspicious because it meant I wasn't being vigilant enough, wasn't preparing for the inevitable disappointment. I'd learned to find safety in emotional numbness, to trust only in the familiar pain of never being enough. Graduation approached with no real sense of achievement, only relief that I'd survived another test. My parents attended the ceremony, took photos, expressed appropriate pride in my accomplishments. But their praise felt hollow, performative, designed more for the other families around us than for me. Even in moments that should have celebrated my success, I remained a prop in their performance of successful parenting. The job I took after college was their choice, naturally. A position at a respected accounting firm where I could build a stable career and contribute meaningfully to society. The work was mind-numbing, but it provided structure, clear expectations, measurable outcomes. I excelled because that's what I'd been trained to do, but I felt like I was living someone else's life, following a script I'd never agreed to memorize. My apartment was a studio across town, the first space that was truly mine. But even there, I heard their voices, felt their judgment, questioned every choice from the color of my curtains to the food in my refrigerator. Independence was supposed to feel liberating, but it was terrifying when you'd never learned to trust your own preferences, your own instincts, your own right to exist as an individual. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving of my second year out of college. I was 24, living independently, supporting myself by all external measures. A successful adult. But at that dinner table, surrounded by extended family, I felt like I was still 8 years old, still waiting for permission to speak, still afraid of saying the wrong thing. My cousin Emma, 2 years younger, was talking about her new job teaching art to elementary students. She was animated, passionate, clearly in love with her work despite the modest salary and uncertain future. Money isn't everything, she said when Uncle Paul questioned her career choice. I'd rather be poor, unhappy than rich and miserable. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my parents' faces, saw the subtle disapproval, the way they exchanged glances that communicated volumes about Emma's naivety, her selfishness, her poor decision-making. And I realized with devastating clarity that I would never be allowed to choose happiness over security, passion over practicality, authenticity over approval. Not without losing everything I'd been taught to value about family, duty, and responsible adulthood. Asterisk that night, lying in my childhood bed surrounded by furniture that hadn't changed since I was 12, I made a decision that would alter everything. I was going to start therapy. Not because I thought my parents had been abusive, I still didn't have that vocabulary, that understanding, but because I felt like I was suffocating, living a life that belonged to someone else, following rules that made no sense but felt impossible to break. Finding Dr. Reynolds took months. I researched therapists the way I'd researched everything else in my life, looking for credentials, reviews, evidence of competence. But I also needed someone who wouldn't immediately dismiss my concerns, who wouldn't tell me I was lucky to have parents who cared so much about my success. I needed someone who might understand that care and control could coexist, that love and harm weren't mutually exclusive. The first session was terrifying. I sat in her office, surrounded by soft lighting and comfortable furniture, and had no idea what to say. How do you explain that nothing traumatic ever happened to you, but you feel broken anyway? How do you describe the absence of something you're not sure you ever had? How do you complain about parents who fed, clothed, and educated you, who never hit you or called you names or did any of the obviously terrible things that justify therapy? Tell me about your childhood, Dr. Reynolds said, and I launched into the practice narrative I'd perfected over the years. Good parents, stable home, excellent education, opportunities many children never receive. I spoke for 20 minutes about my advantages, my gratitude, my recognition that I'd been fortunate compared to so many others. That's a beautiful story, she said when I finished. Now tell me how it felt. The question caught me completely off guard. How it felt? I'd never been asked about feelings, only about facts, achievements, measurable outcomes. Feelings were irrelevant, selfish, potentially dangerous if they led to poor choices or unrealistic expectations. Feelings were something you managed, not something you explored or honored or used as information about your own experience. I don't understand, I said, and I meant it. The concept of examining my emotional experience as valid data, as important, information worth exploring, was completely foreign. In my family, feelings were obstacles to overcome, not wisdom to access. Dr. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. When you think about being a child in your house, what do you feel in your body right now? The question bypassed my rational mind entirely. Suddenly, I was aware of tension in my shoulders I'd carried so long I'd stopped noticing it. My stomach felt tight, nervous, the way it had every day walking home from school, never knowing what mood I'd find when I opened the front door. My hands were clenched in my lap, prepared for criticism that wasn't coming, but that I couldn't stop expecting. Scared, I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. I feel scared. That admission opened something I'd kept sealed for 24 years. The tears came suddenly, violently, as if every unexpressed emotion from my childhood had been waiting for permission to exist. I cried for the little girl who learned to make herself invisible, who believed love had to be earned through perfect behavior, who never learned that she deserved affection simply for existing. Dr. Reynolds didn't try to stop the tears or reassure me that everything was fine. She sat quietly, occasionally offering tissues, allowing me to experience emotions I'd been taught were inappropriate, indulgent signs of weakness. For the first time in my life, someone witnessed my pain without trying to fix it, manage it, or explain it away. Your parents weren't intentionally cruel, she said when I finally stopped crying. But the impact of their parenting on you was still real, still valid, still worth exploring. Sometimes the most damaging environments are the ones that look perfect from the outside. Those words changed everything. Not immediately healing, isn't that simple or linear? But they gave me permission to examine my experience without immediately dismissing it, to consider that my feelings might be valid, even if my parents had good intentions. The concept that impact mattered more than intent was revolutionary for someone who'd been trained to prioritize other people's feelings over her own. Over the following months, Dr. Reynolds helped me identify patterns I'd never recognized. Way I apologized for everything, including things that weren't my fault. How I sought approval from authority figures with desperate intensity while being unable to accept compliments from peers. The exhausting hypervigilance that left me constantly scanning for signs of disapproval, rejection, or anger in every interaction. You learn to survive in an environment where love was conditional, she explained during one particularly difficult session. That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility to unlearn those patterns if you want different relationships as an adult. The hardest part was recognizing how deeply these patterns had infiltrated every aspect of my life. At work, I took on impossible workloads rather than risk disappointing anyone. In friendships, I gave endlessly while struggling to ask for anything in return. In romantic relationships, I performed the version of myself I thought the other person wanted rather than risking rejection by being authentic. I started keeping a journal, documenting moments when I felt like that scared child again, when I caught myself seeking approval or avoiding conflict at the expense of my own needs. The entries were heartbreaking to read, day after day of evidence that I'd never learned to value my own thoughts, feelings, or desires as legitimate. One entry particularly stands out. Today I ate lunch alone because I was afraid to ask my coworkers if I could join them. I convinced myself they probably wanted privacy, that I'd be intruding, that it would be selfish to impose. But really, I was terrified of rejection, of hearing no, of being reminded that I'm not automatically welcome anywhere. I'd rather be lonely than risk finding out I'm not wanted. The work was exhausting. Every day brought new awareness of how thoroughly I'd been trained to minimize myself, to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own existence. But slowly, painfully, I began to reclaim pieces of myself I'd never known existed. I started saying no to extra projects at work. Not dramatically, not rudely, but firmly. The world didn't end. My boss didn't fire me. My coworkers didn't hate me. These small acts of self-advocacy felt revolutionary, like tiny rebellions against 24. Years of conditioning, I began expressing preferences about where to eat, what movies to see, how to spend weekends. Such simple things, but they represented fundamental shifts in how I understood my right to exist as an individual with valid opinions and desires. The most challenging part was learning to tolerate other people's disappointment without immediately trying to fix it. When friends expressed frustration with my new boundaries, every instinct screamed at me to apologize, to return to my previous people-pleasing patterns, to sacrifice my needs for their comfort. But Dr. Reynolds reminded me that healthy relationships could survive disappointment, that people who truly cared about me would want me to have boundaries. You're not responsible for managing other people's emotions, she told me repeatedly. You're only responsible for expressing yourself honestly and treating others with respect. If they can't handle your authenticity, that's information about them, not a failure on your part. This lesson was particularly difficult when it came to my parents. They noticed the changes immediately, though they couldn't articulate what was different. I was less deferential, less eager to please, more likely to express mild disagreement or suggest alternative plans. These tiny acts of independence were met with subtle but unmistakable disapproval. Asterisk, you seem different lately, Mom said during one of our weekly phone calls. Her tone carried that familiar undertone of concern mixed with criticism. More distant. Are you having problems at work? Financial difficulties? You know you can always talk to us if something's wrong. The implication was clear. Something must be wrong if I wasn't behaving according to their expectations. My growth, my increasing comfort with my own voice, my gradual development of boundaries, these were symptoms of problems that needed fixing. Not evidence of healthy development they should celebrate. I'm fine, Mom, I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it. Not perfect, not problem-free, but genuinely fine in a way that didn't require their approval or understanding. I'm just growing up, I guess. The silence that followed was loaded with their confusion and disapproval. Growing up and their understanding meant becoming more responsible, more compliant, more grateful for their guidance. It didn't mean developing independence, questioning their wisdom, or prioritizing my own needs alongside theirs. This tension escalated over the following year as I continued therapy and made increasingly visible changes to my life. I changed jobs, pursuing a position at a nonprofit that paid less but aligned more closely with my values. I started dating again, but this time I chose someone based on compatibility and genuine connection rather than their potential to impress my parents. I began traveling, taking weekend trips and vacation days for experiences rather than productivity. Each choice was met with subtle resistance from my parents, who expressed their concerns through questions designed to highlight the impracticality, selfishness, or poor judgment of my decisions. Are you sure this new job is wise? Does this man have stable employment? Shouldn't you be saving money rather than spending it on trips? Their questions weren't unreasonable on the surface, but I could hear the underlying message. I was making choices they wouldn't make, therefore I was making mistakes. I was prioritizing happiness over security, authenticity over approval, my own judgment over their guidance. This represented a fundamental challenge to the power dynamic we'd maintained for 25 years. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner when I was 26. I've been in therapy for 2 years, had been dating David for 8 months, and was finally beginning to feel like an adult with agency over my own life. The conversation turned to my cousin Emma, who had just gotten engaged to another teacher she'd met at her school. "Such a shame," Dad said, cutting his ham with deliberate precision. "2 teachers' salaries, no real financial security. They'll struggle their whole lives because they chose romance over reality." Something inside me snapped. For the first time in my life, I spoke without calculating the consequences, without worrying about their reaction, without prioritizing their comfort over my own truth. "Maybe they chose love over fear," I said quietly. "Maybe they decided being happy was more important than being rich." The silence that followed was deafening. Every family member at the table stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped breathing. It seemed I had violated the fundamental rule of our family. I had disagreed with Dad publicly, questioned his wisdom, implied that their values might not be the only valid ones. "Excuse me?" Dad's voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that had terrified me as a child and still triggered my fight-or-flight response as an adult. But I was tired. Tired of performing agreement I didn't feel. Tired of pretending their way was the only way. Tired of making myself smaller to preserve their comfort. I said maybe they chose love over fear. Maybe being happy with someone you care about is worth more than having a big bank account but being miserable. That's an incredibly naive perspective, Sarah. Mom's voice carried that familiar disappointment, but this time it felt different. Less devastating, more manageable. Financial security provides stability, opportunity, the ability to care for your family. Romance fades, responsibility endures. "Maybe," I said, my voice growing stronger, "but so does resentment. So does the feeling that you wasted your life doing what other people thought you should do instead of what made you feel alive." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had and most painful. For the first time, I spoke about my experience of childhood, about feeling like love was conditional, about the pressure to be perfect, about the loneliness of never being allowed to be authentically myself. They were genuinely shocked. In their minds, they had been exemplary parents who provided everything a child could need. They had sacrificed, planned, worked tirelessly to give me opportunities they'd never had. The idea that their parenting had caused me pain was not just surprising, it was deeply offensive. "We did everything for you," Mom said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We gave up our own wants, our own dreams, to make sure you had every advantage. How can you sit there and act like we failed you?" This response was predictable but still devastating. They heard my attempt to explain my experience as an attack on their character, a denial of their sacrifices, an ungrateful rejection of everything they'd provided. They couldn't understand that I was grateful for the opportunities they'd given me while also acknowledging the emotional cost of how those opportunities had been delivered. "I'm not saying you're bad people," I said, trying to find words that might bridge the gap between our perspectives. "I'm saying that your way of showing love through control, through conditional approval, through making me earn affection hurt me. Maybe you didn't mean for it to hurt, but it did." Dad's face had gone red, a sign of anger I'd learned to fear from childhood. "Control. We taught you discipline, responsibility, the importance of making good choices. If that's control, then yes, we controlled you, because that's what parents do. They guide their children toward success. But you never asked me what success meant to me," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "You decided what my life should look like and then spent 18 years molding me to fit that vision. You never considered that I might have different dreams." different values, different ideas about what would make me happy. The argument continued for over an hour, each side becoming more entrenched in their position. They saw themselves as loving parents who had made difficult sacrifices to ensure my well-being. I saw them as well-intentioned people who had confused love with control, care with conditioning, preparation with pressure. By the end of the evening, nothing was resolved. We had aired grievances that had been building for decades, but understanding remained elusive. They left that night convinced that therapy had filled my head with dangerous ideas about victimhood and blame. I went to bed emotionally exhausted, but also strangely relieved to have finally spoken my truth, regardless of how it was received. The aftermath was predictable. Phone calls became less frequent, more stilted. Holiday visits were tense, filled with careful conversations about safe topics. They treated me like I was going through a phase, a temporary rebellion that would eventually pass once I came to my senses and recognized their wisdom, but I wasn't going through a phase. I was going through a transformation, slowly reclaiming parts of myself that had been suppressed for so long I'd forgotten they existed. With Dr. Reynolds' help, I was learning to trust my own judgment, to value my own feelings, to believe that my needs and desires were as valid as anyone else's. The work wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the old patterns reasserted themselves with devastating force. During particularly stressful periods at work or in relationships, I would revert to people-pleasing, to seeking approval, to making myself smaller, to avoid conflict. But now I recognize these patterns when they emerged, could name them, could choose different responses. Dating David became a laboratory for practicing new ways of being in relationship. He was patient with my tendency to defer to his preferences, gentle when I apologized for things that weren't my fault, encouraging when I struggled to express my own needs and desires. With him, I learned that conflict didn't mean the end of love, that disappointment didn't require immediate fixing, that I could be imperfect and still be worthy of affection. "You don't have to earn my love," he told me one evening after I'd spent an hour apologizing for being tired and not wanting to go out. "It's not a transaction. It's not something you have to work for or prove you deserve. It just is." The concept was foreign, almost incomprehensible. Love that existed without conditions, without requirements, without the constant need to prove worthiness through behavior and achievement. It took months for me to begin believing him, years to truly internalize the truth of unconditional affection. At 27, I made the decision to change careers entirely. The accounting job that had provided stability and parental approval was slowly killing my spirit. Every day felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit, playing a role in someone else's story. I wanted to become a social worker, specifically to help children who were struggling with family dynamics, emotional regulation, or developmental trauma. The irony wasn't lost on me. The child who had been raised to believe feelings were irrelevant wanted to spend her career helping other children understand and process their emotions. The daughter who had learned to make herself invisible wanted to advocate for young people who needed someone to see them, hear them, validate their experiences. Telling my parents about this decision was one of the most difficult conversations of my adult life. I knew they would see it as a betrayal of everything they'd invested in my education, a rejection of the stable future they'd worked so hard to secure for me. But I also knew that continuing to live their vision of my life would eventually destroy whatever authentic self I was working so hard to discover and nurture. Social work? Mom's voice over the phone carried that familiar tone that barely contained panic. "Sarah, you have a stable career, a good income, opportunities for advancement. Why would you throw that away to work with troubled children for a fraction of the money?" "Because it matters to me," I said simply. because I want to do work that feels meaningful, that aligns with my values, that makes use of my experiences in a way that could help other people. Your experiences. Dad had picked up the extension, and I could hear the concern in his voice. What experiences? You had a good childhood, excellent education, every opportunity we could provide. What experiences could possibly prepare you for working with damaged children? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with assumptions and misunderstandings that felt too vast to bridge. How could I explain that my experiences of emotional neglect, conditional love, and psychological control had taught me to recognize pain that others might miss? How could I make them understand that the very parenting they were so proud of had given me empathy for children who felt unseen, unheard, conditionally valued? I understand what it feels like to be a child who doesn't feel safe expressing themselves, I said carefully. I know what it's like to believe love has to be earned through perfect behavior. I think those experiences could help me connect with kids who are struggling with similar issues. The silence that followed was heavy with their confusion and hurt. They had worked so hard to provide me with safety, stability, and opportunities. The idea that I felt unsafe in any way was not just surprising, it challenged their fundamental understanding of their own parenting, their own love, their own success as parents. We don't understand where this is coming from, Mom said. Finally, we gave you everything we could. We sacrificed so much to ensure you had a better life than we did. How can you say you didn't feel safe? This was the heart of the disconnect between us. They equated physical safety and material provision with emotional safety. We couldn't understand that a child could be fed, clothed, educated, and protected, while still feeling emotionally unsafe, still learning that love was conditional, still developing survival strategies that would take years to unlearn. The conversation ended badly, with hurt feelings on all sides and no real understanding achieved. They felt attacked and unappreciated. I felt misunderstood and dismissed. The gap between our perspectives seemed insurmountable, built on fundamentally different definitions of love, safety, and successful parenting, but I went back to school anyway. At 27, I enrolled in a master's program in social work, taking evening classes while working reduced hours at the accounting firm. The coursework was challenging in ways I hadn't expected, not because of the academic material, but because of how it forced me to examine my own childhood experiences through new lenses, learning about child development, attachment theory, and trauma responses gave me vocabulary for experiences I'd never been able to articulate. I learned about emotional neglect, psychological control, conditional love, and the long-term impacts of growing up in environments where children's emotional needs are minimized or ignored. Reading about attachment styles was particularly revelatory. I recognized myself immediately in descriptions of anxious attachment, the constant need for reassurance, the hypervigilance around others' moods, the tendency to sacrifice my own needs to maintain relationships, the deep fear of abandonment that drove me to please everyone, even at great personal cost. Children develop secure attachment when their caregivers are consistently responsive to their emotional needs, my professor explained during one lecture. When children learn that their feelings matter, that they will be comforted when distressed, that love doesn't depend on their behavior, they develop confidence in their own worth and in the reliability of relationships. I thought about my own childhood, about learning that my feelings were inconvenient. That comfort came only after I'd demonstrated appropriate remorse for whatever had triggered my distress. That love was always contingent on meeting expectations. No wonder I'd grown up believing I had to earn affection, that my needs were selfish, that other people's approval was more important than my own well-being. The practicum portion of my program placed me in a residential facility for children who had been removed from their homes due to abuse or neglect. Working with these kids was simultaneously heartbreaking and healing. I saw my own childhood patterns reflected in their behaviors, the people-pleasing, the hypervigilance, the desperate need for approval, the belief that they were fundamentally unworthy of love, but I also saw their resilience, their capacity for growth when provided with consistent care and unconditional positive regard. Watching 10-year-old Marcus learn to express anger without expecting punishment, seeing 12-year-old Anna begin to believe that adults could be trusted to keep their promises, witnessing these children slowly develop confidence in their own worth, it gave me hope for my own healing. "You're really good at this," my supervisor, Janet, told me after observing me work with a particularly challenging case. "You have an intuitive understanding of what these kids need. Have you considered specializing in trauma work?" I had, actually. The more I learned about childhood trauma and its long-term effects, the more I understood my own experiences and the more passionate I became about helping other families avoid the patterns that had shaped my early years. But pursuing this specialization would require additional training, more school, more time investment in a career my parents already disapproved of. The decision to continue my education and specialize in family therapy in childhood trauma was the final break with my parents' vision of my life. When I told them about my plans to pursue additional certification, to potentially open my own practice working with families dealing with complex dynamics, their reaction was swift and devastating. "We can't support this anymore," Dad said during what would be our last real conversation for over a year. "We've watched you make one poor decision after another, throwing away everything we worked to give you. We raised you to be responsible, practical, grateful. This therapy has filled your head with ideas about victimhood and blame that are destroying your judgment. We love you," Mom added, her voice thick with tears, "but we can't pretend to approve of these choices. Maybe when you come to your senses, when you realize what you're throwing away, we can rebuild our relationship. But until then, we need some distance." The ultimatum was clear: return to their version of my life or lose their support and approval entirely. It was the same choice they'd presented when I was 17 and considering Columbia, but this time I was emotionally prepared to choose myself. "I understand," I said, surprised by how calm I felt. "I'm sorry you can't support my choices, but I can't live your life anymore. I need to discover who I am when I'm not trying to earn your approval." The silence that followed felt final, heavy with the weight of a relationship that had never learned to bend without breaking. We spoke briefly a few times over the following months, stilted conversations about weather and work that carefully avoided any mention of our fundamental disagreements. The estrangement was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even though I knew our relationship had been unhealthy, even though I understood intellectually that their love had always been conditional, losing their approval still triggered the abandonment fears I'd carried since childhood. There were moments when I considered calling them, apologizing, returning to the safe predictability of living according to their expectations. But David reminded me during those dark periods that safety and health weren't the same thing. "You were safe in their version of your life," he said one evening when I was particularly struggling with doubt. "But you weren't happy, you weren't growing, and you weren't becoming who you're meant to be. Sometimes the scariest choice is also the healthiest one." He was right, of course. The work I was doing in graduate school, the clients I was beginning to help, the person I was becoming when I stopped performing for their approval, all of this felt more authentic, more alive, more genuinely me than anything I'd experienced. In the first 27 years of my life, Doc, my thesis focused on the long-term effects of emotional neglect in families that appeared functional from the outside. I interviewed dozens of adults who, like me, had grown up in homes where basic needs were met, but emotional needs were minimized. where love was conditional on behavior, where children learned to suppress their authentic selves in favor of parental approval. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. High-achieving adults who struggled with self-worth, who had difficulty maintaining intimate relationships, who lived in constant fear of disappointment or rejection. People who had been raised by well-meaning parents, who simply didn't understand that providing for a child's physical needs wasn't enough. That emotional attunement and unconditional love were as necessary as food and shelter. The most insidious form of childhood trauma, I wrote in my thesis, is the kind that happens in families where no one realizes trauma is occurring. When parents believe they are providing excellent care because they never hit, never yell, never obviously abuse, they and their children can go decades without recognizing the impact of emotional neglect, conditional love, and psychological control. Defending my thesis was both professional achievement and personal vindication. The research was solid, the writing was strong, and the implications for family therapy were significant. But more importantly, I had transformed my own pain into something that might help other families avoid similar dynamics. Dr. Reynolds attended my defense, beaming with pride as I presented research that had grown directly from our work together. "You've taken your experiences and used them to create something meaningful," she told me afterward. "This is what resilience looks like, not pretending the pain didn't happen, but transforming it into wisdom that can benefit others." Starting my own practice was terrifying and exhilarating. I specialized in working with families dealing with what I called invisible trauma, dynamics that caused real harm but didn't fit traditional definitions of abuse or neglect. Parents who meant well but struggled with emotional availability. Children who were achieving academically but suffering emotionally. Families where everyone was trying their best, but no one felt truly seen or understood. The work was deeply satisfying, in ways my accounting career had never been. Every day brought opportunities to help families develop healthier communication patterns, to teach parents about emotional attunement, to support children in developing authentic self-expression. I was using my own experiences of conditional love and emotional suppression to help other families recognize and change similar patterns before they became entrenched. My client base grew quickly, largely through word-of-mouth referrals from families who had experienced breakthroughs in their relationships. I worked with parents who were shocked to discover that their well-intentioned focus on achievement and behavior modification had left their children feeling emotionally unsafe. I supported adults who were realizing that their childhood experiences of psychological control had shaped their ability to trust, to set boundaries, to believe they deserve love. One case in particular stayed with me. The Hendersons were a successful family. Dad was a surgeon, mom was a professor. Their 16-year-old daughter, Emma, was an honor student involved in multiple extracurricular activities. They came to therapy because Emma had begun having panic attacks, refusing to eat, and expressing what they called irrational fears about disappointing them. "We don't understand," Mrs. Henderson said during our first session. "We've given her everything the best. Schools, music lessons, tutoring, opportunities we never had. We've never abused her, never even raised our voices. Why is she acting like we're terrible parents?" Emma sat silently beside them, shoulders hunched, avoiding eye contact. I recognized her posture immediately, the way I had learned to make myself small, invisible, hoping to avoid criticism or disappointment. When I asked her to describe her experience at home, her words could have been my own from decades earlier. "I feel like I can never be good enough," she whispered. "Every A- is a failure. Every small mistake becomes evidence that I'm not trying hard enough. They say they love me, but it feels like they only love me when I'm perfect. And I can never be perfect enough." The work with this family took months. The parents genuinely loved their daughter and were devastated to learn that their high expectations and conditional approval had created the very anxiety and perfectionism they were now trying to address. They had confused love with pressure, support with control, preparation for success with psychological conditioning that made Emma believe her worth depended entirely on external achievement. "We were just trying to help her reach her potential," Dr. Henderson said during one particularly emotional session. "We didn't want her to settle for mediocrity, to waste the opportunities we were providing." How is that wrong? It's not wrong to have high expectations, I explained. But when children learn that love, approval, and affection are contingent on meeting those expectations, it creates anxiety, perfectionism, and a deep fear of failure. Emma needs to know that you love her whether she gets A's or C's, whether she makes mistakes or succeeds, whether she chooses the path you want for her or discovers her own dreams. Helping this family heal required the parents to examine their own childhoods, their own relationships with achievement and approval. Like many well-intentioned parents, they were repeating patterns they had learned, believing that love expressed through high expectations and conditional approval would motivate their daughter to succeed. But success built on fear of disappointment is hollow, unsustainable, and emotionally costly. Emma needed to learn that she was valuable independent of her achievements, that her parents' love wasn't something she had to earn through perfect behavior, that mistakes were opportunities for growth rather than evidence of fundamental failure. Watching this family transform their dynamics was deeply healing for me. I saw my own parents and the Hendersons loving people who had confused control with care, who believed that emotional distance and high expectations were necessary for raising successful children. But I also saw hope in their willingness to change, to recognize that their impact on their daughter was different from their intent. The breakthrough came when Dr. Henderson was able to tell Emma, with genuine emotion, "I love you because you're my daughter, not because of anything you do or achieve. Even if you never got another good grade or won another award, you would still be the most important thing in my life." Emma's tears in that moment mirrored my own. It was the declaration I had spent my entire childhood longing to hear, the unconditional acceptance that every child deserves, but not every child receives. Witnessing her receive those words, seeing her begin to believe in her own inherent worth, felt like healing something broken in my own inner child. The success of cases like this one established my reputation as a therapist who could work effectively with high-achieving families struggling with invisible emotional dynamics. I began receiving referrals from other professionals, speaking at conferences about emotional neglect in seemingly functional families, writing articles about the long-term effects of conditional love and psychological control. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my work was the letters I received from former clients, teenagers who had learned to trust their own voices, parents who had discovered new ways of expressing love, families who had broken cycles of conditional approval that had persisted for generations. 3 years into running my practice, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my mother, her voice hesitant and unfamiliar after so many months of silence between us. She had been reading articles I'd published, she said, and wanted to understand more about my work. "I saw the piece you wrote about emotional neglect," she said carefully, "about children who feel like love is conditional. I didn't understand what you meant before, but reading your words, I think I'm beginning to see things differently." The conversation was awkward, tentative, filled with long pauses and careful language. But it was also the first time in our relationship that she seemed genuinely curious about my perspective rather than focused on defending her own. She asked questions about my research, about the families I worked with, about the long-term effects of parenting styles that prioritized achievement over emotional connection. "Did we do that to you?" She asked finally, her voice small and uncertain. Did we make you feel like our love depended on your behavior? The question I had longed to hear for years was finally being asked, but answering it felt complicated. The simple answer was yes, absolutely. But I also understood now that their parenting had been shaped by their own experiences, their own fears, their own understanding of how to prepare a child for success in an often difficult world. You made me feel like I had to earn love through perfect behavior, I said gently. You taught me that my feelings were inconvenient, that my needs were selfish, that disappointing you was the worst thing I could do. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but the impact was real. The silence that followed was heavy with her processing, her recognition, her grief for the relationship we might have had if she had understood these dynamics earlier. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. I thought we were being good parents, she whispered. We thought discipline and high standards were what you needed. We were so focused on making sure you succeeded that we never considered whether you felt loved. This conversation opened a door that had been closed for years. Over the following months, my parents began attending their own therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in family systems and intergenerational patterns. They were learning about their own childhoods, recognizing how their parents' emotional distance and conditional approval had shaped their understanding of love and parenting. The work wasn't easy for any of us. There were sessions where old patterns reasserted themselves, where they fell back into defending their choices rather than examining their impact. There were moments when I questioned whether true reconciliation was possible, whether the gulf between our perspectives could ever be bridged. But slowly, painfully, we began to build a different kind of relationship. They started asking about my work with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. They began expressing pride in the person I had become rather than disappointment in the choices I had made. Most importantly, they began to acknowledge that their love for me had always existed, but had been expressed in ways that felt conditional and controlling. We're proud of you, Dad said during one particularly emotional family session. Not because you're successful or accomplished, but because you had the courage to become who you needed to be, even when it meant disappointing us. That takes strength. We didn't teach you wisdom you had to find on your own. Hearing those words was like receiving something I'd been waiting for my entire life. Not just acknowledgement of my achievements, but recognition of my inherent worth. My right to exist as an individual with my own dreams and values and ways of being in the world. The relationship we built wasn't perfect, no relationship is, but it was authentic in ways our previous dynamic had never been. They learned to express affection without conditions, to show interest in my life without trying to control it, to offer advice without making it feel like commands. I learned to set boundaries without cutting them off entirely, to share my experiences without requiring them to perfectly understand or validate everything I felt. David proposed on a quiet Sunday evening in our apartment, with no fanfare or elaborate planning. Just a simple question about whether I wanted to spend the rest of our lives figuring out this thing called love together. When I called to tell my parents, their response was everything I had hoped for years earlier but had stopped expecting. We're so happy for you, Mom said, and I could hear genuine joy in her voice. David is a good man who clearly adores you. We can't wait to celebrate with you both. The wedding was small, intimate, focused more on meaning than appearances. My parents attended without trying to control the planning, without expressing disappointment about choices that differed from their preferences. They danced at the reception, laughed during toasts, and seemed genuinely happy to see me, happy rather than focused on whether my happiness met their approval. But perhaps the most healing moment came during the father-daughter dance. As we moved slowly to music I had chosen, Dad leaned close and whispered, I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. I love you, Sarah, not because of anything you've achieved or any way you've made me proud, but because you're my daughter, and you always will be. The tears that followed were just mine. Around us, guests who knew our history, David's family, my colleagues, friends who had supported me through the difficult years of estrangement, were crying too. It was a moment of healing that felt miraculous precisely because it had seemed impossible for so long that marriage with David continued to be a laboratory for practicing new ways of being in relationship, but now from a place of security rather than desperation. I had learned to believe that I deserved love, that my needs mattered, that conflict didn't mean abandonment. These lessons, hard won through years of therapy and painful growth, allowed me to show up as a full partner rather than as someone constantly seeking approval or trying to avoid disappointment. When we decided to have children, the decision brought up unexpected anxiety. I was terrified of repeating the patterns I'd grown up with, worried that I would unconsciously pass on the conditional love and emotional control that had shaped my early years. But I was also excited about the opportunity to create a different kind of family, to raise children who felt seen, heard, and valued for who they were rather than what they achieved. Pregnancy gave me 9 months to prepare not just practically, but emotionally. I read everything I could about secure attachment, emotional attunement, and child development. I continued therapy with Dr. Reynolds, working through my own childhood experiences so they wouldn't unconsciously influence my parenting. Most importantly, I talked extensively with David about the kind of parents we wanted to be, the values. We wanted to model the ways we would express love that didn't depend on our children's behavior or achievements. When Lucy was born, the first thing I whispered to her was, "I love you exactly as you are. You don't have to do anything or be anything to earn that love. It just is." The words were as much for my own healing as for her introduction to the world. Promised that her childhood would be different from mine, that she would grow up knowing her inherent worth. Parenting conscious of my own childhood patterns was both easier and harder than I expected. Easier because I recognized the controlling impulses when they arose and could choose different responses. Harder because breaking generational cycles requires constant awareness, intentional choices, and the courage to parent differently than you were parented, even when those patterns feel familiar and safe. When Lucy had tantrums, I focused on comfort rather than control. When she made mistakes, I emphasized learning rather than punishment. When she expressed emotions that were inconvenient or difficult, I validated her feelings while teaching her appropriate ways to express them. These approaches felt foreign at first, completely different from how I had been raised. But they also felt right in ways that reached my deepest instincts about what children need. Asterisk, watching my parents become grandparents was perhaps the most healing aspect of our reconciliation. They approached Lucy with a gentleness I had never experienced as a child, delighting in her personality rather than trying to shape it, celebrating her discoveries rather than correcting her mistakes. It was as if they were practicing a different kind of love, one they hadn't known how to offer me but were learning to express through her. "She's so confident," Mom observed one afternoon as we watched 3-year-old Lucy explaining an elaborate game she had invented. "She just assumes people want to hear what she has to say, that her ideas matter." "That's what happens when children grow up feeling secure," I said gently. When they know love isn't conditional on their behavior, they develop confidence in their own worth. Mom nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her processing the implications not just for Lucy's development, but for the understanding of how different my own childhood experience had been. These moments of recognition continued to occur, opportunities for healing that I had never expected, but that proved essential for building our new relationship. My practice continued to grow, now focused specifically on what I had termed hidden family trauma, the subtle but powerful dynamics that occurred in families that looked successful from the outside but struggled with emotional connection, conditional love, and intergenerational patterns of control. I began training other therapists in recognizing these patterns, speaking at conferences about the long-term effects of emotional neglect, and writing a book about healing from childhood experiences that didn't fit traditional definitions of abuse but still caused significant harm. The book, titled To Them, it was Parenting: The Hidden Impact of Conditional Love, became a bestseller within months of publication. It resonated with thousands of readers who recognized their own experiences in the stories I shared, who finally had language for childhood dynamics they had never been able to articulate, who found validation for pain they had been told wasn't legitimate because they hadn't been really abused. The letters I received from readers were overwhelming in their gratitude and recognition. Finally, someone understands was a common theme. I thought I was crazy for feeling damaged by parents who never hit me, never called me names, never did anything obviously wrong. Thank you for helping me understand that emotional neglect is real trauma, even when it happens in families that look perfect. Dr. Reynolds attended the book launch, beaming with pride as she watched me speak to a room full of people whose lives had been touched by similar experiences. You've transformed your pain into purpose, she said afterward. This is what resilience looks like, not pretending the hurt didn't happen, but using it to help others heal. Now, at 28, sitting in therapy sessions with families struggling with dynamics I recognize intimately, I often think about the journey that brought me here. The scared child who learned to make herself invisible. The teenager who believed love had to be earned through perfect behavior. The young adult who chose safety over authenticity because she didn't know any other way to exist. That journey was painful, often overwhelming, sometimes seemingly impossible. But it led me to work that feels deeply meaningful, to relationships built on authenticity rather than performance, to the ability to break generational cycles and create different patterns for my own family. I think about the clients I've helped, recognize that their childhood experiences were valid, even if they didn't fit traditional definitions of trauma. The families who have learned to express love without conditions, to value emotional connection over external achievement, to see their children as whole people rather than projects to be perfected. And I think about my parents who had the courage to examine their own patterns, to acknowledge the unintended harm they had caused, to learn new ways of being in relationship even in their 60s. Their transformation gives me hope for every family willing to do the difficult work of breaking unhealthy cycles, of choosing growth over defensiveness, of prioritizing connection over control. The work continues. In my office, in my home, in every relationship where I choose vulnerability over protection, authenticity over performance, present moment awareness over old patterns of seeking approval. It's daily work, this business of healing from invisible wounds, but it's also the most important work I've ever done. To them, it was parenting. To me, it was trauma. But now, finally, it's also the foundation for something better, for healing, for understanding, for love that doesn't require performance, for the possibility that every generation can do better than the one before.